CEC Gurukul lecture. In today's lecture, I am going to talk on the topic kinship systems in India, cross-cultural variation with reference to understanding marriage rule and exchange of gift during the ceremonial exchange of gift. So, this is a part of the series on kinship studies. In this lecture, we will see how kinship system, which is kind of understood as a universal institutions where rules and norms vary from culture to culture, and this understanding of variations will help us to understand how kinship structures society and provides us a way of understanding the entire society as holistic way, and this understanding of the cross-cultural variation is reference to Indian society. A lot of literature exists on understanding marriage rules, and we can understand kinship in terms of kinship terminology. Kinship terminology is basically refers to term which we use to kind of address or refer to an individual, and a terminology or a term will tell us that two individual or maybe more than two individual have a logical relation with them, and many a time the term will explain the relation. So, based on the logical relationship, anthropologists have identified several kinship terminology, and one of the most important classification in kinship terminology is the one given by Morgan. Morgan classified kinship terminology into two categories. One was descriptive and the other was classificatory. His understanding of this was basically based on studies of African society, but we will also see how the understanding of descriptive and classificatory helps us to understand the allocations of roles and responsibility. There is also in terms of the line of descent which help us to understand the variation in kinship terminology. So, when we talk about descriptive terminology, it implies that we are using one specific term, and this term will exactly express the relations that we have with the other person. So, term is used exactly to refer to that. So, kinship terminology kind of is used for several purposes. That is, it can be varying from society to society. It could range from 10 to thousands of terms. So, in some society, you kind of combine relative and use one term, which is classificatory. You would classify a number of relatives into one category and refer to them by one term itself, or you use specifically term for each and every relation. So, it could be a number of terms could vary from say 10 to 1000, and it helps us to understand the social organization in terms of roles and responsibility. So, kinship relations are classified differently in different society, and therefore, different systems of kinship terminology. When we talk about especially the cultural variation, we will try to understand that in North, we see it's descriptive, and descriptive, as I have already said, that a particular specific term will be used to express the relation between the user of the term and the individual for whom the term is being used. So, it expresses the exact relation. The system of terminology in North India is also known as bifurcate collateral. Bifurcate because it bifurcates on the patrilineal and matrilineal line of descent. As we know that in there is a kind of a difference in terms of two separate category or two groups in North India, that is one which is formed through blood relations and the other which is formed through marriage relations. So, bifurcates on terms of using in general, as we know, we would be using separate term for people related through our father's side and another set of term for people for those who are related through the mother's side. That is why it is kind of called as bifurcate, and the distinction is made at the level of collateral. A descriptive kin term is unique. So, it has exactly a separate term for each relation, and only one meaning can be assumed from it. For instance, if we kind of look into the English term cousin, it does not make a distinction whether it is a patrilateral cousin or a matrilateral cousin. But in North India, the terms will exactly tell you whether it is a matrilateral relative or a patrilateral relative. So, the terms are used as such to describe the kinship relation from the standpoint of the speaker. So, the speaker's exact relation with the addressee will be expressed through the term. The descriptive character of such terminology is so strong that in such a few terms even the most distant kin can be appropriated. So, it is not single term, you can many a time add 2 or more terms, but the exact relation will be established. So, in anthropology there is a kind of a distinction between near relative and distant relative. Near relative would be people who we kind of are close to the elementary group. So, the elementary group would be the father, mother, son, daughter, and then people who are related, say father's brother, mother's brother. So, these are the people who are known. Now, if there is a 3 degree or 4 degree of relations, then it kind of gets confused if it is a classificatory terminology. North India descriptive terminology will exactly tell what the relation is. So, the distinction is on the distinction is on the line of descent. So, a patrilineal or your patrilateral consanguine relative would be different from the final relation. There is also difference in terms of age. So, an elder brother would be referred by a different terms and a younger brother would be referred by a different term. Then there is also in terms of distinction on gender. So, the father's brother and mother's brother would be exactly referred by 2 different terms. So, when we look into the descriptive terminology, what is the advantage? And here we look into the significance, we say it will express the exact social behavior that you are supposed to have with the individual. So, it is also kind of tells you what is the expected behavior. So, because there is a distinction between the line of descent, and in North India the patrilineal line of descent is followed. So, the patri clan or the group is kind of given a dominance over the matri group. So, father's relatives are kind of given a higher status than the mother's relative, and this is reflected through the terms which is being used. It also lays down the exact prescriptive behavior and also the prohibited behavior. So, there are certain kind of behavior, the terms will tell you that whether you can have a formal cordial relation with the individual or you need to maintain a relation of avoidance. So, classificatory terminology is found more in South India. Now, according to Morgan, classificatory terminology we club together a number of relatives on certain kind of ideas. So, for instance, if you have a patrilineal society, then all members of a particular patrilineal at a one level would be referred to as by the same term. Now, this classificatory terminology with reference to South India is clearly expressed in Louis Dumont's study of South India, which is kind of he refers to as Dravidian kinship. And when we look into the Dravidian kinship terms, it kind of divides the speaker's generation into following category. One group consists of all the brothers and sisters, including one's parallel cousin and the children of the father's parallel cousin. So, when we look into the concept of cousin, there is a distinction between parallel cousin and cross cousin. Parallel cousin are children born of the same sex sibling, that is father's brother. So, they are both are male members, their children would be considered as parallel. Cross cousin, it is children of the opposite sex sibling. So, father and his sister, the father's children and sister's children are kind of considered as cross cousin. So, when we say in South India there is a practice of cross cousin, it implies that the ego, that is a male reference point, would marry FZD, that is father's sister's daughter, that is a cross cousin. So, in South India there is a clear distinction between parallel and cross cousin. Now, the second kind of variation other than terminology would be variation in rules of marriage. When we look into rules of marriage, we know there are 2 rules. One rule is a positive rule, that is, it tells you, prescribes you with whom you can actually marry. And the second rule is a negative rule, which kind of prohibits whom you cannot marry. Now, entire marriage rule is kind of structured around kinship system. So, the prohibition and prescriptive is in terms of what relation you have with the individual. So, every marriage in a given family, it also kind of builds new relations. It also kind of as we know in theory, also in reality, that marriage and an institution leads to formation of new groups, and how the individual are related to that group will kind of also vary. So, if it is a line of descent is kind of patrilineal and the group formation is patrilocal, then it is the women who has to move and from her house and go to another's house, which in kind of lot of feminist literature it has been women has been referred as disposable. That is, they kind of do not have a space to belong. They are born into one space and then they have to be shifted to another. That is because of the rule of exogamy, that one cannot marry within the same elementary family and you need to find a marital partner outside the group. So, when we look into the variation in rules of marriage, the kin relationship operate within the context of rules of marriage. The institution of marriage also lays down relationship between the bride giver and bride taker. Now, this is one is at the level of trying to understand whether there is a prescriptive and prohibited. The other is kind of North India will see that it kind of structures a hierarchy on the basis of marriage. So, if you are a bride giver, that is you daughter from your family goes to the other family or the group here, then you are giving. So, you will be labeled as bride giver, and then the other group is bride taker, that is the groom's family. Now, there is a relation of superiority and inferiority, and the bride givers are considered as of low status than the bride taker. This again kind of talks about the gender relations in terms of kind of considering women as subordinate, and therefore, because they are moving from one place to the other, their parents are considered as inferior to the male family, which is considered as bride taker. So, the hierarchy is very evident through the rules of marriage. And when we look into the ceremonial exchange, we will see how this hierarchy is expressed through the direction in which the gift will flow. So, when we talk about the negative rule, or we can say it is the prohibited rule, we talk about exogamy, because exogamy says that one cannot marry within one group, whether it be the elementary group or at the level of subcaste or at the level of village. So, there is a clear boundary between kind of relatives which are prohibited or which are not allowed to enter into a marriage rule. So, marriage rules are negative in the sense that rules prohibit certain members from being marriage partners. So, the cluster of lineage ties up to 4-5 generation is kind of known as a clan or gotra. Why we try to understand what is a clan or gotra is also to understand that there is a negative rule which we term as gotra exogamy, where there is a in North India there is a 4 rule of gotra, that you cannot marry certain relatives up to certain generation, that is say 4 generation from the father's side, who would be considered as sharing the same blood, and therefore, they cannot be considered as marital partner. So, in anthropological literature, there is a clear-cut dichotomy, or there is a kind of distinction between biological relations and affinal relations. So, when we talk about the 4 Gotra rule, we see that this has been referred by Iravati Karve in her work, that is Kinship organization in India, that in North India we have the 4 Gotra rule. What is this 4 Gotra exogamy? According to this rule, a man cannot marry a woman from his father's Gotra, his mother's Gotra, his father's mother's Gotra, and his mother's mother's Gotra. This is the 4 level in which exogamy has to be maintained, on the assumption that these members, all the relatives, would be sharing the same blood, and therefore, by the fact that they share the same blood, they become siblings. And because this biological relation or consanguine relation is opposed to a final relation, marriage cannot be established. And we are also familiar that there is also the rule of village exogamy, that you cannot marry a person who is of the same village. Now, the second rule is the positive rule or the prescriptive rule, which is found in South India. Now, in South India, the emphasis is not to kind of prohibit, but it prescribes. It exactly tells you who are your marriage partner. So, the emphasis is whom you can marry rather than on whom you cannot marry. And the positive or prescriptive rule, there are three types of rules. First is that marriage between a man and his elder sister's daughter. So, the elder sister's daughter and a man's son are cross cousin, and that would be a kind of a acceptable marriage relation. The second is man's marriage to his father's sister's daughter, and this kind of is practiced by some crowd. So, when we refer to the second, that is father's sister's daughter, then we look into a tendency of kind of even reciprocity, which is very important when we look into the alliance theory. Cross cousin was based on the idea of giving women and taking back women. This is idea of Levi-Strauss, which he calls in terms of exchange of women. So, the reciprocal relation which is created at one level is kind of settled. So, you give a daughter and you take back a daughter, the reciprocity is immediate and it is kind of completed. Whereas in North India, it is not a reciprocal relation, it is a hierarchical relation. The third type of cross cousin which is referred in South India is between a man and his mother's brother's daughter. So, these are the category of cross cousin which are prescribed. Now, when we look into the case studies in anthropology which has been given, we see the Havik Brahmins of Karnataka, Reddy caste of Andhra Pradesh and Kallar of Tamil Nadu, they practice cross cousin marriage. So, they practice the third category, that is mother's brother's daughter, and here there is a kind of return policy is practiced. So, you take a bride and you give back a bride, and the reciprocity is kind of completed. Now, when we look into other variations other than the two rules, that is the positive and the negative, we see the other variations as well. So, in caste like Ahir, Khatti, Garasia, Chadawa, these are different castes in different parts of the country. They have a combination of patrilateral and matrilateral cross cousin. So, when we say that the kind of patrilateral is marrying your father's sister's daughter, matrilateral mother's brother's daughter. So, there is a combination of both matrilateral and patrilateral. Incidence of cross cousin is also found in parts of Maharashtra, and where there is a kind of marrying your cross cousin in many way. The fifth understanding of variation, that is trying to understand variation in terms of geography. The second is in terms of understanding variation in lineage system. The third is in terms of understanding the distinction in terms of kinship terminology. Fourth, marriage rule, and fifth variation is ceremonial exchange of gift. Now, this ceremonial exchange of gift is very important because it structures relation. It also reflects on the relation that is established between gift taker and gift giver. So, there is a reciprocity is either a settled or there is a hierarchy which is created. So, when we look into kinship structure based on the location of an individual, in several hierarchy are characterized, and he gives and receives gift on different occasions in many parts of North India, communities in North India. The exchange of gift is regular. It kind of takes place on all life cycle rituals, on all festivals, but there is a direction of exchange which becomes different. So, we will see how the direction of exchange from North India and South India is different. This kinship practice has been observed by anthropologists as reflecting pattern of behavior. The pattern of behavior, and also in terms of hierarchy, in terms of gender relations, it becomes very significant. So, in North India, we have one directional flow, that is the gifts are flowing from say the inferior, that is, as I already said, that the bride giver are at a lower status. So, the gift flows from the bride giver to the bride taker. So, in say it is also can be conceptualized as dowry, and the logical validation of dowry was that it was a compensation for the women, additional member in the family, and therefore the bride family had to give the kind of maintenance of that particular individual in whose addition was in the house. So through marriage the composition of the family changes. So the as I already said, that in a patrilineal line of descent, the residence is patrilocal. So the woman has to leave her natal house and move to her marital house. Now because she is going to add a number into the marital house, it was compensated by the fact of giving dowry. So but then what happens is, and what is problematic is, that the hierarchy which is created at the time of marriage is sustained and strengthened throughout. So the direction of flow is unidirection. It continues from bride giver to bride taker, and it starts at the institution of, say, even the negotiation of marriage. So once the two group has decided to enter into an alliance, the flow of exchange starts, and it kind of continues from the, say, the birth of children to life cycle rituals to every occasion. It is the flow from the bride family to the bride taker's family. Now in such arrangement, the gift becomes an indicator of status of the family, and that is why we need to understand how dowry becomes problematic. How much you give, how much of assets you give to your daughter becomes a mark of your status. So it becomes also a kind of a competition, and there is always a desire to give more, and it kind of adds an economic burden to families which cannot actually afford to give that. So it is not only kind of something which is restricted to family, it becomes then an economic find, and it kind of helps us to, it is also in terms of very easy way to earn certain or have access to certain resources which through the institution of marriage. So whether we talk about ceremonial exchange or we label it as dowry, it is in North India, it is from one family to the other, and it also kind of affects gender relations. So the kind of gift that a bride carries with her on the marriage also ensures her status in the in-laws family. So we have heard a lot of cases where in terms of dowry death, in terms of kind of violence which is inflicted because the flow of gift was not adequate. Now when we talk about these category, we know that there is a gift giver. And who's the gift giver? It is the male members, generally the bride's father and the brother, who becomes responsible as gift giver throughout the life. And gift is an ongoing activity. It starts with the negotiation of marriage, and it kind of continues in many of North India society, even continues at the death of the women. And then it is also kind of gift taker, who are superior, and they kind of always have this kind of status symbol that they need to get the best gift or the higher quality gift. So what we can conclude that in North India, the flow of gift is unidirection from kind of bride giver to bride taker. Now when we compare it to South India, in South India the gift exchange is reciprocal. Reciprocal in the sense it is kind of taken and returned back. So reciprocity is egalitarian relation is maintained. You give gift and you take back gift. So the process of gift giving and taking is identifies the separation or assimilation of various categories of kin. So generally we try to understand that with whom would a reciprocal relation be established. A reciprocal relation would be established with people who are close kin, and it would therefore be able to make a difference between the close kin and the distant kin. So in South India there are two categories of gift. One category is gift which is exchanged between affines. Affines are relatives who are established through the marriage, and this category includes exchange of gift between the family of the bride and the groom, and it is a two-way flow. It's not unidirection, it is two-way. So both of them, they kind of exchange gift. Internal exchange of gifts between people who belong to both the sides of exchange, the receiver as well as the giver. Therefore, both of them are receiving gift from each of them. So, there is a cultural variation between north and south if we see. So, it comes to exchange of gift and also in terms of understanding gender relation, because in North India the flow is unidirectional from the girl's family to the boy. It strengthens patriarchal relations. In South India, which is a matrilineal relations, the flow of reciprocal kind of brings in more egalitarian relations, though there are a lot of kind of understanding, or there are a lot of critique of understanding whether matrilineal society is gender balanced, because in a matrilineal society there is also the concept of matrilineal puzzle, where the line of descent is through the female, but the sharing of power and authority is into the man's hand, that is either mother's brother or sister's son. So, the egalitarian concept is kind of debatable, but it is compared to North India, it is more egalitarian. Now, if we kind of conclude, we will look into this understanding of north-south comparison of kinship system. This chart will help us to have a very quick understanding of the difference or the variance. The dimension is a kinship group. North India is patrilineal, patrilocal. South India is matrilineal, matrilocal. Kinship terminology in North India is descriptive. In South India, it is classificatory. Marriage rules in North India is negative, which is prohibition. South India, it is positive, prescriptive. And ceremonial exchange in North India is one directional, South India it is reciprocal. So, we see the contrast between the north and south, but let us keep in mind that these are anthropological model case studies, and it is not necessarily that the exact model would be found in empirical reality. There could be lot of divergence and there could be many differences, but this model will help us to understand the larger structure of kinship system in North and South India. With this, I come to an end of today's lecture. Thank you.